I would like to request the speakers to come on the stage one by one. First of all, I'd like to request Mr. Khalid Rahman, the Executive President, IPS. Dr. Waqar Masood Khan, the former Federal Secretary of Finance Division. He's an eminent economist and has special interest in Indian society, economy and politics. Dr. Sonu Kangrani is not here with us today. We are instead joined by Mr. Sufi Hussain, who's a PhD from Germany on the issue of Dalits in Pakistan in the context of Indian Dalit framework. Dr. Akis Kalaitzidis, Professor of Political Science at Department of Government of International Studies and Languages at University of Central Missouri. He teaches international relations, European politics, and US foreign policy. And he's an author of US Foreign Policy, a documentary and reference guide, and several other books and research papers. Dr. Natasha Cole, a brave and fearless lady, that's my own input, British Indian academic, economist, novelist, and poet. She's an associate professor of politics and international relations at University of Westminster, London. She writes and speaks on issues of political economy, neoliberalism, economic justice, and economic violence. Mr. Murtaza Shibli, who's a British Kashmiri journalist, author, poet, and security specialist. He's the author of 7/7 Muslim Perspectives and the editor of KashmirAffairs.org. This session would be chaired by Ambassador retired Zamir Akram Sahab. He has served as Pakistan ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations, and this is one of the many diplomatic assignments during his career. I hand over the session to the chair, Ambassador retired Zamir Akram, and look forward to a very informative session.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Due to my own tardiness, we are starting a bit late, so I apologize for this. And also to get us back on the track, move right into the discussion. And the speakers, as you know, have already been introduced, so I will not dwell on that either. I would now like to call on Dr. Junaid Ahmed. So the first speaker to talk on the political economy of Hindutva is Dr. Waqar Masood. So you have to.
I compliment IPS for holding the second international conference on Hindutva, and the theme is obviously related to the status of minorities in India. Well, the topic that is assigned to me is the political economy of Hindutva. To start off, frankly, Hindutva is not a political movement. It is neither a political ideology. It is a nationalist movement, and much of its concern is to create the hegemony, political hegemony of the largest denomination in Indian population, which obviously are Hindus. But they are extremely diverse. There is no way that you can characterize them as a unified religion, a unified nation, yet this is really the attack. Regarding the political economy of Hindutva, since its focus is other than economics, its larger symbols are non-economic. Yet, an attempt to discern some economic ideas that they espouse or they care for, it's very difficult to find a unified answer in here also. We see their economic thought evolving. They never addressed economics as such that we would like to associate with them, or we associate with capitalism or socialism, or even something within the context of Islamic teachings on the subject of economics. So what we see that their economic philosophy or economic teaching are evolving over the years. They are not consistent. There wasn't any one time in which they defined certain economic positions, but they changed their positions as the circumstances demanded.
So I would reflect very briefly over at least 7 periods during which the economic thought of Hindutva, one can say it was fashioned or pursued. The one period is pre-partition, and that's the time when these are formative years and the idea is very nascent and they are at the very margin of Indian society. The second period is when partition took place and India has a polity, there is a constitution, and obviously despite the main arm of Hindutva, which is RSS, the main social organization, it promoted one political party during this period, which was the Bharati Jan Sangh. Then there is a period, so this period runs from 1951 to 64 in the backdrop of Nehruvian economic model, which was socialist in nature and deep controls in the economy. The other period was associated with Ms. Indira Gandhi, and that runs through 64-75, and the Jan Sangh was the party that was supported, and in fact it was actively formed and it continues during this period also. Then there is a period of 1975 and 80 when they did politics with the support of Bharati Janata Party of Morarji Desai and Ram Prakash Narayan, which led to the ouster of the Congress government also. The other period is 1980 to 91 when Rajiv Gandhi came into fore, and a very different type of Congress party emerged during this period. During 96 to 2004, it is BJP, but it was in and out of the government during this period, but it completed one full term also during 99-2004. And then they were out for 10 years, and rise of Modi is the phenomenon that is still going on. So I will briefly try to touch upon each of these eras in which the economic thinking of Hindutva will emerge. Well, to start off, in the pre-partition times, two leading figures of RSS, or the creators of Hindutva, Savarkar and Golwalkar. Savarkar is credited with the invention of the word Hindutva, which essentially means Hinduness. And Golwalkar was the second Sar Chalak Sangh of RSS, who served in this position from 1940 to 1973, a straight period of 33 years. and he was a towering figure, and his sayings are compiled, and bunch of thoughts and many other literature that reveals what they have. Now, both of them allowed private property, and they were deeply opposed to communism or socialism, and and they were very keen to protect Hindu interests when they are threatened by non-Hindu elements in the society. So you can see the division. In fact, many claim that both of them were capitalistic in mind or in essence, although they disguised their open support for capitalism. Savarkar was very impressed, and both of them were very impressed with what Germany had done, and hence they supported small governments and a large private sector to exist. Now, these two thoughts were somehow opposed in an indirect fashion and then in very direct fashion. Upadhyaya, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, was a very powerful voice within RSS, and Golwalkar liked him a great deal, and he was lent to form Bharatiya Jana Party, Jana Sangh, and in a capacity of Secretary General. This fellow was a very philosophical figure and had a very tall standing within RSS and Bharatiya Jansangh. He advocated so-called integral humanism, and he asked for inclusiveness. He gave the idea that the Hindutva or Hinduism, our nationalism is liberal and inclusive, although not much of it was reflected in actual pursuits that were there. Then there was Deoraz, who succeeded Golwalkar as the RSS chief and was in this position for more than a decade. He was a very down-to-earth personality. He was somebody who cared for the downtrodden. He cared for the untouchables, and he led to a much deeper or much broader deepening of the RSS movement, and both of them in some ways espoused socialistic leanings, okay, not communistic leanings. Socialism and communism were antithetical to Hindutva, and the student wing was formulated essentially to oppose these ideas, and the student wing became very active in Indian politics, and their primary aim was to defeat the rising popularity of socialism and communism in the campuses. Well, all along they supported land reforms, and when in 1977 Janata Party was in government, and they for the first time tasted the political power, there were some moves to undo the land reforms, land ceilings, and the RSS and the Jana Sangh, which was part of it, and in fact it was the largest party in the assembly. They resisted any attempts to undo land reforms. Another theme that has a recurrent appearance in the economic thinking is the status of centralization and decentralization. Now here Apodhya Deen Dayal was the leading light. He, in fact, Golwalkar also supported this thing. They thought that when local governments are strong, this will allow us to bring our messages to the masses, and hence they advocated decentralization as opposed to centralization. Another area is the state-owned organizations. As I have already mentioned, that Hindutva typically promoted the idea of less government. But when it comes to certain industries, they agreed, and from the time of Golwalkar and Savarkar, that in certain industries, if public sector can perform better, they should do this thing. In fact, they even advocated for some time that large tracts of land should be acquired only for the purpose of training farmers with the use of machinery, and hence they were interested in government intervention at a limited scale. But the Nehruvian model, and during Nehruvian time, they were nowhere to be seen politically, although they struggled. It is only after Nehru departed from the scene in 1967 election, they got a sizable presence in the Lok Sabha. So the divestment became an issue in late 70s, early 80s, and since then it is there. So initially they were extremely opposed to divestment or privatization, but subsequently those things were left behind, and they started supporting, and I'll come to, when the Modi time comes, I'll mention how vigorously they are supporting divestments or privatization. One theme that has run from 1905, when the Swadeshi movement started, which is to buy the locally manufactured goods or made in India, that theme really had a stranglehold on the Indian mind, and it continued until when in early 80s Indian economy was in dire straits, and the global scene was changing, and Rajiv Gandhi, etc., they came with fresh thinking, and India had to go to IMF also in early 90s. Now, until then, Swadeshi was a value which was so cherished, and so much people were attached to that. You would remember that there was only one car, Ambassador, that was manufactured, and everybody had to use it, and it was a symbol of austerity also, and people were attached to the local manufacturers. So this thing was advocated by RSS also, it was advocated by Jana Sangh also, and it was advocated until the time of Indira Gandhi now, foreign investment is really a direct outcome of that thinking. And until then, foreign investment was minimal, or it was not encouraged, and India was a closed economy in that sense. But then they started changing their position also, as Rajiv Gandhi government and subsequently Manmohan Singh started that program of economic reforms, and when BJP came into being, that really led to a wholesale change in the position on foreign investment, and they welcomed, they promoted it, and we see that today things would be as it is in many countries, they are allowing. Now, let me come to what classes they are, the interest of what classes they are protecting. Well, they are protecting the interests of farmers, and they promote, they for instance opposed land reform. I mean, they opposed any reversal of land reforms, and they occasionally supported work for food program in the agriculture. They supported subsidies to agriculture, support prices they supported. They supported labor also, and the RSS had a labor wing also. Again, it was in response to opposing communism and socialism that they promoted labor wings of RSS. Then they started championing the cause of middle classes, especially during the time when, after Rajiv Gandhi government suffered political setbacks, and even despite having an unprecedented majority when it was unraveled, there was a great deal of disappointment. And that's the time BJP started tapping into the middle classes. And that's the time when they started raising the bogey of Ram Mandir, etc. So this is a defining moment that middle classes looked up to the Hindutva, which was really a very, as other speakers, Mujib and others have said, it was a very marginal thought in pre-independence time. And finally, this again, soon thereafter, they started appealing to the large businesses. And one particular incident that led to this transformation to big businesses who were firmly entrenched with Congress shifting towards BJP was during this period when in Calcutta, Advani was invited by Birlas and other leading businessmen. And since then, they have a bon haimi between them. And now, as we have seen, this has all culminated in Modi emerging as with an unprecedented victory to form a government without coalition partners. A simple majority he was able to acquire. And we know that the businesses supported them wholeheartedly. And so the businesses, not only just businesses, the corporate sector supported him. And diaspora supported them. In fact, there is a view that much of BJP's economic agenda is designed, is implemented by leading diasporic elements who have come and joined the government also. The free trade is, again, as I mentioned, after the Manmohan government, which again was, interestingly, Congress was a minority and they were able to form the government despite having larger number of seats. BJP could not make that government, and Narasimha Rao government completed a 5-year term, and that's the turning point where Congress shifted towards a free enterprise and economic reforms, free trade, and they were stunned with that victory. And then their whole thing also transformed. Well, the time is running out. Let me just say that a few things. Most of the economic thinking of BJP, RSS, or Hindutva is reactionary. Reactionary in the sense that it is not ideological, and it is always aimed to see the opportunities provided by the rivals. And for a long time, the rivalry was with Congress. So whatever Congress was doing, it was to be opposed. When Indira Gandhi nationalized the industries during 69-75 period, they bitterly opposed it. But when they came initially in a Janata Party, they did not undo the nationalization. And also, when Congress moved towards free enterprise, they did also. Now, to sum it up, what the messages that I have is that there is no economic thought in terms of an ideological stance. Congress has shifted grossly from being a socialistic outlook to the capitalistic outlook. They have done the same thing, and they are pro-capitalistic at the moment, but all through the period, their primary focus has been Ram Mandir. Their primary focus has been scrapping of Article 370 from the Constitution so that the Kashmir is made part of the whole, the Indian part of India. They have demonized minorities, especially the Muslims, casting them as enemies, and all these things have aroused the sentiments of Hindus, which essentially is the aim that they have. And we have a situation in which the interests of minorities are not protected. Mercifully, Indian Constitution doesn't allow them to change the definition of Hindus. They would want to, and there are writings, they want to give second-rate citizen status to all minorities, especially those who are, according to their claims, have either converted or they have come from outside. And they, as Mujib Saab has mentioned, it's no longer the days of Shuddhi, but these are the days of new terms. So Ghar Wapsi or Love Jihad are the type of terms that are coined. And under Modi, one has seen the violence against minorities has been unprecedented. So the economics is peripheral. The nationalistic agenda is to gain hegemony for the majority and to the disadvantage of minorities, or subjugation, or total denial of the rights, basic human rights of minorities. So this is the state in which we find Hindutva at the moment, and clearly one hopes that the recent 5 states elections, if it is any indication, we see a pushback, and I think India has a great deal to lose if it goes away from the ideals that were enshrined in the Constitution. There would be a wholesale re-engineering of Constitution to achieve the agenda of Hindutva. And the pushback that we see in the 5 recent state elections is clearly a hope that the Hindutva, which is reigning supreme at the moment, will be somehow pushed back, and minorities will have a sigh of relief from this long dark night of Hindutva in its most horrible display that the Indian nation has seen in the last 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sufi Hussain, who will present a paper by Dr. Sonu Kangrani, who cannot be with us today. Dr. Hussain, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum, distinguished guests and speakers. Thank you so much for gracing me with an opportunity to speak on behalf of Dr. Sonu Kangarani, our Dalit intellectual, founder of Dalit Sujag Tehreek and CEO Thardeep. Unfortunately, he could not be the part of this wonderful gathering here and has asked me to excuse to you all on his behalf, as on this very day he has been called on by the monitoring committee constituted by the Supreme Court of Pakistan regarding the situation of drought in Thar. He has, however, sent his speech in writing for this occasion, and I have been honored to deliver it on his behalf. So here it goes. Assalamu alaikum, and distinguished guests, chair of the session, Ambassador Zamir Akram, the co-panelists, and the audience. It is really a privilege to be invited by the Institute of Policy Studies. I would like to thank Khalid Rahman, Executive President of the IPS, and Nawfal Shahrukh to provide an opportunity to speak on behalf of my community. I have been asked in my capacity as the President, as the Pakistani Dalit, to shed light on Hindutva and the status of minorities in India. In this brief speech, I would specifically like to draw the attention towards the hegemonic dimensions of Hindutva that have the capacity to penetrate across national borders and infect us globally. An Indian friend on a WhatsApp call told that yesterday I was at an apartment and taking the elevator when a boy around 8 to 9 years of age also took it. He was having a pistol in his hand, saying that he would lead the Indian army and finish all the anti-nationals and Pakistanis. My friend just jokingly told him, "Beta, you are needed on the border. That would be better." What I am saying is that the Indian middle classes, which are predominantly Savarna Hindus, want to enjoy their hegemony by sacrificing the lives of Jawans from OBC Dalit communities. Sang's solution to everything is that if the Muslims and Christians don't like the Indian, then they must leave India. Now, like in typical Sanghi language, is to accept Brahminical hegemony, be a second-class citizen, and not ask for any rights equivalent to the Savarnas. The most dangerous role has been played by Sanghis and social media, which is creating a warlike situation. The thing is that many of these hate-mongers were waiting for such an issue to come so that they do their chest thumping and keep the atmosphere hot, so that other important issues such as caste discrimination and class-based inequalities get into cold storage. I believe that the Hindutva ideology, with its fascist core, is based on the expansionism and the imposition of one ideology, one religion, and one nation at the cost of the extermination or the dilution of all other ethnic groups, religious minorities, and schools of thought. Apart from fomenting religious communalism, Hindutva has at its core the culture of caste-based discrimination that regulates society through the establishment of Brahminic hegemony. The research done by Dalit scholars and non-Dalit scholars, state institutions, NGOs, and the UN furnish the sufficient body of empirical evidence to argue with conviction that caste discrimination and untouchability prevails throughout South Asia and the countries where Savarna castes migrate. Several research reports and studies confirm that caste discrimination and untouchability is practiced globally, particularly in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Japan, North Korea, UK, USA, in the Gulf, and in certain African countries. In most of these countries, Dalits lie at the margins of hegemonic social and political power, and because of caste discrimination, continue to suffer from political, economic, and cultural untouchability and political manipulation. Keeping in consideration its global reach, United Nations has declared casteism as the human rights abuse, a global phenomenon that affects 250 million people worldwide, and has recommended in its rapporteurs to member countries to take measures to eliminate caste discrimination and the discrimination based on descent. Based on the empirical evidence, Dalit scholars argue that caste is the mode of production, that it forms both the base and superstructure of South Asian societies and communities. That caste kinship are descent-based genealogical systems that provide the forms of social mechanism to divide and distribute labor, social respect, or the prestige. Therefore, it is at the roots of social, economic, and political processes that create oligarchic political system based on belief in the inherited right of certain caste families or the genealogies to dominate and rule to the exclusion of Dalit Bahujan class. To begin with, the statistics constituting 2.4% of the humanity and 1/6 of the South Asian population, Dalits have been by far the largest and the oldest surviving segregated, excluded, and disenfranchised group. There are 260 million Dalits in the world, out of which 16.6 crores or 85% live in India. In Pakistan, most of the so-called Christians and Hindu population, about 6 million, make up the Dalit class. We Ambedkarites believe that in India, Dalit Bahujan groups, including scheduled castes, collectively make up the majority population in terms of their demographic strength. This reduces the Savarna caste to 15% of the total Indian population. Hence, in terms of demographic strength, Dalit Bahujans make majority class in India, although in terms of the privileges, access to resources, the social respect and status, and as Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum suggest, in terms of the potential to develop to the fullest of one's capabilities, Dalit Bahujans lag far behind Savarna class. There is only one reason behind this historical structural injustice and exploitation, and that is Hindutva, or what we empirics call Brahmanism, the cultural dimension of the political ideology of Hindutva. Brahmanism is the social practice of discrimination based on ascribed status assigned by virtue of birth in a particular caste and is legitimized through the fascist ideology of Hindutva. Brahmanism rides over the back of Hindutva to migrate wherever the Savarna goes and resists any attempt at the eradication of the disease they carry. See, for instance, the case of the influential influential Hindu, Sikh, and Jain communities in UK, all being under the spell of caste pride, prohibit the passage of bill aimed at the legislation against caste discrimination. Or have a look at the capitalist Brahmanic lobby pushing for the introduction of Brahmanic version of Indian or South Asian history and Vedic mythology into the history and social science curriculum for the middle schools in California and USA. This relative difference in power of the Dalit Bahujan and the Savarna Brahmanic lobby at global, national and local level is symbolic of the hegemonic relations that exist between the oppressor and the oppressed since centuries. I think that Nepal is so far the only country having recognized the caste discrimination as the major problem, and to some extent deals with it in line with universal principles of equality, liberty and justice. Compared to it, the situation of Dalits in India fares worse. Although, unlike Pakistan, India has certain constitutional and legal provisions for the protection of the rights of minorities and vulnerable ethnic groups and castes, such as Scheduled Caste Atrocities Act of 1989 and the Article 15 of the Indian Constitution about the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Yet, due to the hegemony of Hindutva forces, the laws emanating from the constitutional provisions have so far proved to be a mere rubber stamp. In 2006, the statistics for India are horrifying. In 2016, for instance, the official conviction rate for Dalit atrocity cases was just 5.3%. Recent statistics indicate that every week 13 Dalits are murdered, 5 Dalit homes are burnt, 6 Dalits are kidnapped or abducted, and 21 Dalit women are raped. In practice, virtually there are scores of ways in which Dalit and tribal people are subject to indignity, violence, and abuse. Along with the economic and political aspect of the problem, the cultural hegemonic dangers of Hindutva are equally the matter of concern, particularly the network of Babas and Gurus. The likes of Sadhguru and Ravi Shankar, fluent in English and expert in brainwashing, are spreading Hindutva ideology across the world. The fascist agenda of the Hindutva, working through the soft power of the Hindu mystics, can also be had from the speech of Nityananda, who sits on the golden throne proclaiming that I am sitting on this throne because it is Hindu tradition. If I do not sit like this, if I do not wear this golden jewelry, then our tradition will be lost. I am here to revive not just the enlightenment science of Hindu tradition, but I am here to revive food style, living style, dressing style, the construction style, jewelry, everything of Sanatan Dharam. Let me clear that their Sanatan Dharam is in fact the euphemism for Hindutva. Sanatan Dharam, as the Dalits believe in, does not care about the specific mundane issues or the lifestyles, and does not crave for gold, but for the search for eternity and spirituality in its sublime form. Similarly, the internationally renowned yogic cults, such as that of Baba Ramdev, is spreading Brahmanism in the guise of Vedic health tips, vegetarianism, and marketing the Ayurvedic herbs. The owners of the billions of rupees worth properties and the huge infrastructural facilities at their disposal, these gurus or babas are further joined by the army of intellectuals led by the likes of Swami Subramanian, the BJP RSS think tank, and Rajiv Malhotra, patron of the Infinity Foundation, the American-based Hindutva organization. They are persistently spreading Hindutva poison across the world by writing books, holding talk shows, and by making extensive use of social media. Dear friends, the point that I am trying to make is that it is not only Sangh Parivar led by the RSS and politically patronized by the BJP that is responsible for the spread and perpetuation of Hindutva, but the whole culture industry led and promoted by the primitive forces of darkness working under the guise of Hindu culture to revive Vedic traditions and fascist version of Hinduism in the names of Sanatan Dharma, the reverberations and increasing impact of which can also be felt on the ethnic and religious communities, including Muslims living in Pakistan. In the context of India, it can be inferred that Dalits are appraised and humiliated despite the existence of laws passed by the Indian government to protect the Dalits from caste-based abuses. Based on that fact, I believe that although passing of laws is the necessary passage, the successful implementation of it requires the moral ethical reformation of society. Hence, I believe that SCs, OBCs and ST reservations are useful but not enough to uplift the Dalits. And there is an overwhelming consensus on that count among Dalit community. The real problem that the Dalits are beset with in India is that of their recognition as equally dignified group of indigenous communities and the recognition of their appraised and marginalized status. Compared to India, the situation of Dalits in Pakistan is better in terms of reciprocal respect that we have from the Muslim majority. Yet in terms of socio-economic and the political uplift, we are lagging far behind, primarily due to the predatory and hegemonic political dimension of Jati Hindus. As an insider, I have deeply observed social and cultural changes that my community have gone through during the last 4 decades. While Meghwar community had gained in terms of educational advancement, the rest of the scheduled caste communities still lagging far behind in terms of political representation and access to economic resources, the major reason for which is the domination of Jati Hindus in the name of Hindu religion and Hindu culture. Dear friends, I must confess that our Dalit community is not immune, particularly in India, from the influences of Hindutva, the evil creed that is not their product, but imposed upon them by the oppression of time. Nonetheless, we, the Dalits of Pakistan, feel relieved to have been saved from the direct domination of Hindutva forces. In such a scenario in which Hindutva is trapping our Dalit community to serve them as foot soldiers in any possible conflict or war against the real or imagined enemy, I feel extremely concerned about the future of my community living both in India and Pakistan, as in both countries, Dalits are believed to be Hindus, which I contend is not true. We are not Hindus, we were never Hindus in terms of religion that Savarna caste have practiced or is still practicing. They are the worshippers of Manu Maharaj who codified caste system, and we are the disciples of Lord Shiva, the Dravidian deity, the god that is ours, but even our gods they are snatching from us. We are the Dalits of Pakistan. We are not Hindus by any definition even before. We were not Hindus by any definition even before partition. In Sindh, we were indigenous Sindhis. In Punjab, indigenous Punjabis, and in Balochistan, we were indigenous Baloch, but not Hindus. In the beginning, unfortunately, it was our Muslim neighbors that began labeling us as Hindus simply because we did not practice any organized religion. But the reality of the faith is that we share most of our customs, habits, and religious practices with Muslims. We are not merchants, we do not know the trickeries of trade, we do not worship Lakshmi, the money deity, but the Mother Earth herself. Take an example of my Meghwar community. We are the followers of Pir Pithoro, the Sufi Sant, the disciple of Bahauddin Zakaria. A significant majority of Meghwar vote to Shah Mahmud Qureshi simply because of that reason. We eat beef and bury our dead. And this holds true of almost all major Dalit communities living in Pakistan. Bhil and Meghwar and Umarkot join our Shia Muslims in their rituals of Muharram, and in Mithi we observe every Eid with equal zeal and fervor as our Muslim brothers, except that we do not go to pray into mosques, but that considerably holds true of going to the temples as well. Hence, we scheduled castes practice different religion and cherish political ideology that are clearly at variance with and rather contradictory to Jati Hindus. The gods that we worship and our nature of religiosity is way different than religion, culture and values of Jati Hindus or the Savarna class that believe in Vedic myths of Mahabharata and the values of Mahabharata and the legends of Ram and Sita. Based on it, they want to create Akhand Bharat, the greater Hindu Rashtra, aimed at establishing fascist domination of all South Asian countries including Afghanistan. This ominous tendency is being increasingly fed into the brains of Dalits and other non-Muslim groups by Hindutva ideologues particularly the Sangh Parivar, the RSS, their crafty public speakers, gurus, and babas, and Hindutva intellectuals of international renown. Their prime target, the enemy that they have identified, are Muslims in Pakistan. I would rather go to the extent to say that they have even influenced many Muslims within Pakistan to follow their Hindu ideology. Take, for instance, the Sindhi separatist group Jasmam. Our friends, dear friends, our attachment to our is as natural as the shrub of a cactus that survives in third desert even without rain, or that of a tree of rohiro that bears orange flowers even in conditions of extreme drought. From the beginning till this day, we are the community of artisans and pastoralists. The roots of attachment with Pakistan are buried in that primordial dust that predates time. So, to make this speech a bit shorter, I will just cut some portions of the speech and just come to the suggestions or recommendations that Dr. Sonu Khangrani has given to the policymakers and legislators. That he says that I believe that the policymakers, the politicians and think tanks in Pakistan should diversify and broaden their analytic angle to bring Dalit studies into the national and local scope. Dear friends, having explained in detail the impact of Hindutva vis-a-vis its biggest disease, that is casteism, I feel morally compelled and responsible as the victim of it and as a member of the oppressed Dalit class of Pakistan to briefly inform the honorable audience about their socio-political status. So you can read all this detail in the brochure given by IPS, but I would just briefly mention the demands that he makes from policymakers. The demands that he makes relates to constitutional amendments in Article 51, 2A, Clause 3, and he also demands quota or seats for scheduled caste. Redefinition of scheduled caste and Scheduled Caste Act, Atrocities Act must be. He says it must be passed, and Scheduled Caste Rights Bill, and correction in census forms, and he also suggests to abandon minority term, to use minority term for scheduled caste because he believes that they are in majority. Separate electorate or proportional electoral system. And also he demands scheduled caste representation at international level. So in the end, I would just simply, I would again like to thank and appreciate IPS for giving me an opportunity to represent the most neglected communities of Pakistan. Thank you so much for bearing me so long. Pakistan Payindaba.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Akis Kalaitzidis, who will be speaking about the state of Hindutva and the state of minorities in India, responses from the world. There's something wrong with this. Please, Doctor, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be here. It's my first time in Pakistan. I appreciate the invitation by the Institute of Policy Studies, Professor Rahman, and the members of this panel, and our audience. I appreciate your attention. I'm here today to talk about Hindutva in a different context that you have been talking about so far. I am an expert on US foreign policy, and I'm going to try to bring some light through analyzing Hindutva in the United States, which we'll start with discussing a little bit the Indian community in the country and what they want, what they have asked from the US government, and then moving on to discuss a little bit of US foreign policy. I understand that time has limits, and that maybe that we can interact afterwards if you have questions. Again, thank you for bringing me to this wonderful event, and let's talk a little bit about the Indian community in the United States. There are about 3 million Indian Americans, highly educated and increasingly wealthy. They have been organizing for a long while and have been creating Hindutva organizations such as HSS and VHPA. There are about 170 chapters of these organizations in the United States. They have become fairly powerful in certain locations, east and west, but also some interesting outlier areas, such as the south. The Indian community in the United States has been fairly integrated, and in some cases, it has chosen to follow U.S. To try to influence U.S. foreign policy in terms of politics and in terms of religion. In terms of politics, it's fairly easy to explain. I can give you the example of Hindus for Trump, for example, with the big signs during the election of 2016, out there campaigning for the president and making a ruckus, frankly. I don't know if any of you follow American politics, but on September 18th, there was a World Hindu Congress in the United States, which the president very happily attended. During that time, Muslims were not portrayed very nicely. In fact, the beginning of the date, the event, was marked by some fairly racist theater, with terrorists coming in, being attacked. The President of the United States did not object and absolutely loved it. So there is something to be, to think about in terms of how Indian interests in the United States align with political interests and of the Republican Party. And one of the ways to do it is, or one of the ways he has been done, is through extreme assimilation. Now, you would think that once you assimilate in a country like the United States, you lose your nationalism, or at least you replace it with a nationalism of the United States kind. It, however, is with the Indian community a little different. To follow Bobby Jindal's recommendation for assimilation, I don't know if you know who Bobby Jindal is. He was governor of Louisiana, and he was thought of as a person who might run for president of the United States. So he's still active in politics, but he advocated an assimilation of the sort of shedding your religion and joining the Christian side, but keeping Indian interests at heart by excluding Muslims. Muslims become the overarching enemy. It doesn't matter if, of course, there are varieties of, but since the President of the United States doesn't care, the Indian community is more than happy to support that policy and sort of follow the president into this changing religiosity, avoiding going to temple. Don't take part in institutions and rituals. Try to placate the majority religious group in the United States, which is the Christian evangelicals, by becoming part of them, and then using the political side to exclude Muslim extremists, as they say. They have been fairly successful at this, and the Trump administration has featured several of these types of politicians. Now, having said that, if we take a step back and look at the US foreign policy, how it operated for a long time, we may be able to, at the end of this conversation, see some elements that may be positive or negative vis-a-vis Pakistan or vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. First of all, American foreign policy is exceptional. Americans believe that they are the one nation in the world that can do anything, and they have pushed this type of narrative on the world to the point of Bismarck saying that God has providence for drunks, fools, in the United States of America. So they believe they're exceptional, they believe they can do anything, and right now they're at war with Islam. That makes, not all of Islam, of course, extremist Islam, but that makes a difference, and a lot of the innocent will be caught into within this battle. The second element of US foreign policy that I would like to talk about today is primacy. There is an actual policy of keeping the United States the world superpower. You're not surprised, I assume, to hear this, having been a superpower for such a long time, having interacted in Southeast Asia, the United States would like to keep that going. However, as you heard from nearly all of my colleagues so far, and I'm assuming later on, things are changing in Southeast Asia. And along with those changes will come changes in the United States foreign policy. All right, so let's analyze what President Trump's foreign policy will be. But before we do that, let me say a few things about previous foreign policy eras. The Cold War and the War on Terror. Very briefly, during the Cold War, the United States and Pakistan were allies. This alliance continued until and increased during the War of Terror. Now, though, it seems that the United States has decided that it's no longer interested in continuing this war, at least in this area, and is trying to disengage from the world. Doug Stokes, a very famous professor of US foreign policy, has said that during times of weakness, the United States turns inwards. And as such, one expects that the disengagement from Southeast Asia would happen in a general way, more from Pakistan, but also from India. However, if one looks at the particularities of the president's foreign policy today, you see that he has walked away from all of these ideas summarily. In fact, he comes in and he says that international institutions don't matter. Now, the United States has founded a system in 1945 which was explicitly designed, institutionally designed, to promote US ideology and power around the world. The President of the United States is walking away from that. So along with that, is walking away from Pakistan. His foreign policy attitude, his foreign policy thinking is ahistorical. An ahistorical foreign policy thinking by necessity is a problem for Pakistan. It's a problem for a lot of people. It's a problem for Europe to begin with. But for Pakistan, it should be a real problem because he will continuously not give credit to the former ally that has done so much for the country in this region. And that, I expect, will create some backlash. Another part of his foreign policy is that he's protectionist. Now, those of us who I am an example of good liberal international trade policies. I was born in Greece and I am an immigrant in the United States, as well as a professor. So I'm a child of this globalization that happened. which the President of the United States is trying to walk away from. Yet another reason to be worried globally, but also particularly in Southeast Asia. This isn't good news for India as well as Pakistan. If the United States becomes protectionist, it's going to have an effect on all of South Asia, sorry. On top of his anti-global institutions and protectionism and complete lack of historical context, the President of the United States is also a nationalist. Well, I mean, that's normal in, every president of every country, I would assume, would be a nationalist. But this president is particularly virulent against the Muslim community because of the extended engagement of the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq from 2001 and on. The United States public has gotten, I would want to say, tired, exhausted by all this war and all this money and bloodletting, and has decided to give the keys to a person who would completely walk away from the region no matter what happens. Evidence, Syria, which it's a strategic country that the United States thought they might be able to wring away from the Soviet Union or Russia today, and would have liked to meddle under President Obama and have completely walked away under President Bush. Sorry, President Trump. So, essentially, the entire foreign policy of the United States right now is anti-liberal and anti-global, which means, in my mind, not knowing the particulars of Hindu nationalism, that the problems will be exacerbated as opposed to lessened. At least that's what my analysis shows. Now, if you have any further questions, I'd like to entertain them and move forward, but I would like to stop here and give my colleagues a chance to talk. Thank you very much for being so attentive.
Thank you, Dr. Kalaitzidis. I will now give the floor to Dr. Natasha Call, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations, University of Westminster in London, and she will speak on Hindutva and state minorities in India.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm always a little apprehensive when people introduce me as this brave and fearless person, because the first thing that runs through my mind is, what should I be afraid of? My response to that is fearing hate is the worst thing that you can do wherever you are, whoever you are, because hate is not to be something that you must be afraid of, but something that you must pity and then follow up with understanding and then follow up with trying to resolve it. So yes, I'm not afraid, and in front of any audience that will not physically attack me or each other. And that, I think, is the essence of all publics. So I must also add a couple of caveats before I begin. Firstly, I speak for myself. As Virginia Woolf said, a woman, in a sense, has no nation. And in that sense, I speak for myself. I do not represent any nation, community, group, or anything. What I say anywhere reflects my histories, my memories, and my journey of my ideas and spaces. So I speak for myself, and I would also like to add that in spite of the instances of levity and things that I may say with an aside, the fundamental fact of the matter is that what I talk about are cartographies of pain. These are not just lines on a map. These are lines that affect people who are much less fortunate than us to be sitting in safe spaces. I think we all have a right to dream, as Eduardo Galeano said, and that is an important right that we must cherish. Okay, so The topic that I have been, that I was requested to speak of is Hindutva and the state of minorities in India, responses from the world. So let me tell you, as a person of Kashmiri origin who is British and who hails from the subcontinent, there are histories here that are so heavy that any amount of time is impossible to summarize them in. And in a sense, I may even just start by saying, to the Britons, to the Indians, to the Pakistanis, all of you ate up my history, all of you have eaten up the memory, and it's the same for every Kashmiri. These, this is your love people more, love territories less. This is something that has been going on for as long as we've had capitalist modernity, which is to say at least the last few centuries. And we can, not everyone can pick up a gun, not everyone has the power to rule governments, but everyone has a story. And the point of this and many other persecutions that are happening globally against minorities is that we all have our truths, and the important thing is to recognize there isn't a truth with a capital T. There are truths with little t's. And until and unless you physically eliminate people, there is no way that you are going to force somebody to change their truth. So the only way forward is to talk to people, is to get people to talk to each other and understand where their differences lie and how we can move beyond them. So, and this, it seems like a very simple thing. In fact, most of what I tell you, it's all very simple. We all know it at a very fundamental level, but sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to remember. The most, to people who say, oh, these are issues of grand games and strategy and power, and I tell them, you were a child once, right? You had a right to dream. So don't call me an idealist, because everyone is an idealist when it comes to their children. Everyone wants education and healthcare and safe spaces and freedom from violence and freedom from discrimination for their own children. So we can all then try, at least, to be idealists for other people too. And wherever I speak, whatever I do, whoever I challenge, that's what I'm trying to tell you. It may seem like a moral high ground, so what? I think that we all are bound to fail at one point or another, but it's important to remember that that is the only way anyone can move forward. Okay, so with that as preface, let me then say that the Hindutva, we've just been given a very comprehensive account of Hindutva and its very complicated relationship through its various evolutions with economic nationalism. But Hindutva, that as we recognize it today, is something that is prevalent in India in its form of majoritarian religious nationalism. But it's also something that is evident globally in terms of the effects of the diaspora, firstly. But also in terms of the way in which it links as an ideology with other similar ideologies that it interlinks with. The example given just now about the people in the UK who sought to not have caste included as a protected characteristic is a good example of how these forces can work. I'm sure Akis would have referred to, I'm sorry I had to go out, but Akis would have referred to the way in which followers of Trump and followers of Modi see their cause in common. And in fact campaigned. Trump was on record having said, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar," so that tells you something about how these dynamics work. But these are not just stories about people doing these things in terms of a realm that's outside the economy, because economic relationships are a key part of this story too. So the most significant moment for Hindutva is the early 90s onwards, when you have not just the rise of that Hindutva and at present, as we say, see the Modi-led BJP, but also the arrival of neoliberalism. And that is a conundrum that has been inappropriately resolved even now. As scholars, people might want to study the economy in one box and society in the other, but that's not how the world works. These two changes, you can study them as separate trends, but they were happening to people, to societies at the same time. And that's something that merits a lot more analysis. So this form of majoritarian Hindu nationalism, which has evolved after 1990s, reflects a consolidation and a creation of a political cultural majority, which is the self-identity of people, their construction in terms of an entity. And that then becomes politically salient. So it's not a political majority which can change. It's a cultural majority. When a cultural majority becomes a political majority, then democracy starts to be a problem, because people are not voting on political issues, as we know as we would think of them as political issues. So here we are at the brink of elections in this, in India. Here we are in the aftermath of Pulwama. It's an important moment to reflect, I think, for everyone, because some people, of course, want to just watch the world burn, as Batman's butler said in that famous movie. But there are many people who don't want to watch the world burn and who would think otherwise, or for whom it is possible to think otherwise. So I want to say, since it's a global response, I want to say this is part of a global moment. It's a moment that reflects the rise globally of electorally legitimated, misogynist, authoritarian governments that masquerade as nationalists, claim to challenge neoliberalism, while at the same time profiting from it. I'll just repeat that sentence again. These are electorally legitimated governments, not necessarily, I wouldn't say they're necessarily democratic, they're electorally legitimated. They're misogynist authoritarians. To all of these strongman leaders, misogyny is a key component of how they exercise their power, they build their support. And by the way, when I say misogyny, that doesn't mean that women are immune from misogyny. It's just a way in which it works as a strategy of strongman exercise of power. Misogynist authoritarianism, which masquerades as nationalism, and a very toxic version of it, claims to challenge neoliberalism. In all of these leaders do that, but it profits from it because they end up being crony capitalists. So whether you look at the examples, and you can pick any examples, you may like some of them less or more, but I will just randomly pick examples from around the world. Duterte in Philippines, Putin in Russia, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US, Orban in Hungary, just some of the most egregious examples, which have to a lesser or greater extent used this strategy of power. These are, I hesitate to use the word populists, because in most of the cases, including in the Hindutva government currently in power, their actual vote share is nearly 30-something%. So yes, in a scholarly sense, we might say they're populists because they're creating a kind of populism, but it reflects a fractured nature of the electorate. So they don't actually have 100% or 80% of the public behind them. They have just managed to create an ideology that works to create a single bloc amongst many fractured sections of the electorate. How they do that? Well, they do that through, firstly, messianism. This one guy is going to solve all our problems. It's a hagiography of the great leader whose posters you see everywhere. And this great leader is going to come in and solve everyone's problem with a magic wand, because nobody has known how to do politics before. Consensus is a problem, democracy is a problem. This great leader will solve everything. Well, of course, messianism doesn't work in this sense, and the great leader doesn't solve the problems. They see the past as a future. I'm coming here from a Brexit-torn UK. UK united, I mean, really. And this idea of this return to a glorious past as a future works in two ways. For the formerly colonized parts of the world, it works in the sense that we were colonized once, but now we'll find our glory. And this messianic leader will bring you your glory. For that part of the world, it's the same thing, but inverted. We will go back to our past imperial nostalgia as glory. We'll just go back there again with Brexit or with Make America Great Again or whatever, you name it. So in this part of the world, of course, in the Indian context, it works as going back to a nativist past. Now, neither of these two things is wrong. It's not wrong to say colonialism was a tremendously awful process. It literally made and ruined the world. But as a facile retreat into a kind of unquestioning nativism is also a problem, because that again eliminates dissent in similar ways. So these and all of these cases also, I think, since we are referring to Hindutva here, they are preceded by changes in the education systems, and these education systems are where consciousness is created. It also relies upon creating groups, alliances between groups that normally would not see common cause with each other. So if you look at the way in which, people who are corporates, people who are economic nationalists, people who are neoliberals, people who are tribal and, indigenous Hinduized people, they do not have their interests in common. But this kind of political strategy of power creates a discourse that makes them think that their interests are in common. And that is how they come to power in a very fractured society. So it relies upon bringing these disparate groups together, which is why they often can't deliver, as we know from employment or so-called development data. They can't deliver because it's impossible to deliver. The thing to do is to recognize these are disparate interests, and you have to find ways of policy reconciling them, not making people believe that they actually don't have any differences in common, but making people believe they don't have those differences in common and that their interests are not at odds with each other is easier when you sell them, when you use a rhetoric which is moral and metaphysical. So instead of saying something is good or bad or right or wrong, you say something is good or evil. Something is, it's not just wrong, it's not just something you can disagree with, it's fundamentally evil. And you can't disagree with evil. You can, it's not possible to disagree with evil. It's a metaphysical thing. If you have to go through suffering in order, of the soul of the nation, in order to deal with the economic repercussions of demonetization, then that's not a discourse that's about data or statistics or economy. That's about soul and suffering. And that is not, then there's no political left in that theological battle for the soul of the nation. And democracies, modern democracies in these modern nation states that we find in, have to deal with these things with a democratic consciousness. And that democratic consciousness does not mean you do not recognize the place for theology, the place for religion. It means that that place is not where it is right now. But of course, it's profitable for these leaders to do that. I think it is also tremendously unfortunate, as I'm sure Akis would have pointed out, that this is all happening against the backdrop of an isolationist impulse, where we are seeing a delinking, nations choosing to delink from a globally interlinked architecture of norms that was painstakingly built in the aftermath of the Cold War. So when it comes to climate change, human rights, whatever, nations are choosing to say, no, my glory, my sovereignty, Brexit is another example, but anywhere in the world, where this is about me and I can solve these problems within my nation state boundaries. Yes, you can in a world of autarkies, but not in the world that we live in now, and not in the world that has technology. By the way, I forgot to mention the use of technology, of trolls, of that kind of use of technology, both to shock and awe people, as well as to make them feel that, create fake news. This is, again, a key part of how this populist strategy creates majorities where none exist. So it's happening against this breakdown. It's also happening against an Anthropocene. It's happening against a climate change crisis. Disasters, natural disasters, we know, do not discriminate between boundaries that we draw on maps. It's happening against, and these prolonged conflicts and the new emergent threat perceptions seem to just be replicating the Cold War era. It's like we're yearning to go back to a world of those kinds of enemies, and we're trying to create that right now with the threat perceptions, around China, around US, around Russia. And that's, we can continue doing it that way. You'll call me a dreamer, you'll say, we will continue doing it that way. I'll say, fine, I'll just continue protesting, I'll just continue saying that's not the way to create a safer world or a better world or to solve any conflict. Thank you. And we're also seeing this against the breakdown of a liberal democratic consensus where economic inequality is rising. So, people are dispossessed and that is suffering. And they suffer. The state of minorities, when we talk about minorities, religious minorities are, of course, the key ones here, Islamophobia, but also other kinds of attacks on other religions, on Christians and others. Discriminations, not every lynching has to, people don't have to be lynched to be made to feel that they do not belong. Developmental minorities, tribals and indigenous people, gender minorities, intellectual minorities, people who are atheists, rationalists, secularists, are being called anti-nationals, people who speak for science, being told that science isn't real, regional minorities, which are manifest in different forms. Kashmir is, of course, a good example. You won't, maybe this audience will appreciate, you won't imagine the number of times I've been hounded online by people who say, what about Kashmiri Pandits? Well, here I am in Pakistan and I'm saying, what about Kashmiri Pandits? What about it? It is, they are also a religious minority in the Kashmir context. They are also a casualty of the dispute. Until and unless we put all of these things together, we are not going to move forward. Attacks, wars, they're not going to solve anyone's problem in the long run. So I'm saying that we need to talk, that everyone needs to talk. It's the simplest thing, but it's the hardest thing. And I think that talking can also, by the way, so then the other response is go to Pakistan. So here I am, but of course not every dissenter can go to Pakistan. I'm sure you're not large enough territorially to accommodate every dissenter from across the border. So what can be done? I think we must magnify and amplify the moderate voices. We must magnify those who speak against violence, those who speak against war. We must study better post-colonial, I will conclude by giving you hope, of course. We must study post-colonial histories and post-colonial international relations for the world that we live in now. We must call things as they are. You remember how wars are enabled by calling deaths collateral damage? Well, let's do the anti-euphemism. Let's call hawks killers and let's call doves peace builders. Let's say we want, oh, this is a dovish position. Let's say we want a peace-building position. We don't want a killer position. And I think that words make a difference. It's not, strength is a matter of actually what you accomplish, not simply a stance that you a priori have. Do not confuse power with violence. Very often, as Hannah Arendt has told us, very often the resort to violence results from a vacuum of power. When you don't have power, you need to resort to violence. Actual power is built upon agreement, not by the use of violence or weapons. Develop mechanisms of radical democracy. Radical democracy is a theoretical term. Radical democracy means that you see the enemy not as an enemy, but as an opponent. I can disagree with you, we can talk, but if we kill each other, that's not going to matter. It may seem that these are theoretical concepts. They're not. When civilians die, when people are killed, that's not a theoretical position. That's real deaths, and actions result from ideas. And until we change the ideas, the actions will not change. Believe in idealisms for other people, not just for those who look like us. And I hope that people elsewhere listen to this too. That injuries and humiliations of collectives are real. They are real. Nation states have injuries that are very real. And just as hard it is for an individual to recover from humiliation, from the memory of humiliation, it is equally hard for nations to recognize that. And the way to deal with that is not with arrogance. And I just wish that more leaders and more nations would recognize that you have to reconcile with what happened. Right? And the moving beyond can only happen. Otherwise, you can just keep picking at the wound, We can keep talking about colonialism. We can keep talking about those histories in an emotional sense without actually wanting to move forward with, okay, now what do we do about it? And I'm putting forward to you the radical proposition that what we do is talk. We talk with lots of people. We bring lots of people together and get them to talk. And we talk about people who are peace builders, not doves. I don't like the word doves in that context. So demand better of leaders. I said this in the aftermath of Pulwama too. We talk about states. States are not just abstract entities you can pull off a shelf. States are made of people who are as real as you and me and people across the border in India. These are people who have ideas, and those ideas may have their own resilience. But believe you me, sometimes it is possible to move beyond those things. Otherwise, slavery would never have ended. We would never have had decolonization. Nothing would have happened. No conflict. Northern Ireland wouldn't have been resolved. No conflict would have been resolved had it not been possible for people to eventually move forward. I think that I will finally close absolutely by saying justice justice and peace should be seen as verbs. They should be seen as things we create. And I think in this environment of this violence, one may hope for, and I do hope for, better results from the elections. I hope that people recognize what is happening and want to, and actively, I want to say there are people who do recognize the violence that has been carried out in their name. And those are the voices that we need to amplify. Don't practice, I would say to both, certainly to people who believe in Hindutva in India, but I would say more generally to people who believe in ideologies that require corpses. Do not believe in those ideologies. The theorist Laurent Berlant called something cruel optimism. A cruel optimism is when something that you desire is an obstacle to your flourishing. And I think much of this hegemonic, almost insane desire not to talk about things, to move forward, comes from a kind of cruel optimism. It's like, we will not yield. Well, nobody's asking you to yield. Let's start by talking. Let's start by recognizing that there are problems here. And, and of course, the state of affairs, as you know, and by the way, last 10 years at least, you can read details of whatever I've said about many of the things that these speakers have mentioned. They are all, documented. I've said them. I stand by every single word I've said. But I want to also emphasize, yes, this is happening. Let's not lose hope. Every single person, you know, my job is as a gardener. Wherever I go, whoever I speak to, I'm trying to plant a seed in your head. I'm trying to say it's possible. We can dream better. It may not flourish, but if it does, believe me, it'll be worth for every one of us. And you know, not just for me as a Kashmiri individual, not just for my people who are being killed in conflicts, but for everyone. And that's the note of hope I would like to end on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, and as chair, I am
Required to present some of my own views. Let me first congratulate and thank all the speakers for their very excellent presentations, which have added to our knowledge and understanding of this very complex situation. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Khalid Rahman
and the IPS for inviting me to chair this very important meeting. In my remarks, I would endeavor to avoid repeating what has already been said, but since the subject is one that has a broad approach, some kind of repetition is inevitable.
To say that India is a complex and diverse country would be an understatement. India has divisions, distinctions based on religion, caste, language, economic status, among other factors. I say this because it is important to understand what is happening and what has happened in India and what is happening now, I think. And I speak from the perspective of someone who has, in the diplomatic service, served in New Delhi and in the Foreign Office, dealt with South Asia and India in particular. I think that there are two strands that have been underway in India since its independence, or even before its independence. And that has been, especially for the Congress party, which was responsible for fighting for India's independence, a need to unify the country because they recognized these divergences that existed in the country. So for unification, the Indian Congress party and its leaders emphasized secularism. Secularism as the basis for unity in diversity. It was the slogan and remains the slogan for them. But as we have heard, the Congress party from time to time has not been above the use of communal politics for its political ends. And we have seen that happen during the time, right from the beginning of Indian independence, when the judgment on the Babri Masjid issue under the previous British rule was to basically hand over the Babri Masjid to the Muslim Awqaf. But when some people went and placed idols of Ram in the mosque and the issue reignited, Mr. Nehru's Congress government did not implement the ruling of the earlier court. And since that time to the present, we have this dispute that has been lingering. Mrs. Indira Gandhi in her time used Muslim votes for her electoral victories, and at times raised concerns about Muslims with the Hindus to win over the Hindus. So the point is that Indian secularism has served a political purpose, sometimes not very well. For the RSS, BJP, combined VHP, the whole Hindutva family that we call, for them the unifying factor, the common unifying factor from their perspective has been to promote a common Hindu identity. Because, as I said, there are religious differences in India, but the religious differences are there even within Hinduism. And then there are also caste differences. And so to bring these people together on a common platform, you needed a common enemy. And the most easiest common enemy to find has been the Muslim. And for this, history has been used. Muslims of the past have been projected as oppressors, and Muslims of the present and the future as terrorists. We know how several Muslim emperors, kings have been removed from, or attempts have been made to remove them from the annals of Indian history. I have seen roads being renamed, places such as the Taj Mahal being claimed that they were actually designed and created by ancient Hindus. And then there are some really fringe and purely ridiculous claims also that plastic surgery was invented in the old ancient days, and that's how Ganesh came into being, and such other kinds of claims. So suffice it to say that Hindus, or the BJP, has tried, as part of the overall Sangh Parivar, the Hindu family, use or focus on demonizing Muslims in order to promote greater unity within the Hindu family. I just read a few days ago that the Golra incident, the train incident in Golra, where hundreds of Muslims were killed and that led to the massacre of Muslims in Gujarat, were actually engineered by Mr. Modi when he was the chief minister of Gujarat, and the argument is that he was creating the stage for himself to be recognized as a national rather than a provincial or state leader. So that politics is never too far behind. And we've just heard about how there have been thousands, literally thousands of communal riots in India in which Muslims have been targeted. But what is interesting is that the people who are led to target these Muslims, the people who fight against these Muslims, are not upper caste Hindus. Usually they are Dalits and OBCs and lower caste Hindus who are, for one way or another, manipulated to engage in such violence. I also believe that there is no real clash between Islam and Hinduism. I have served as ambassador in Nepal, which is a declared Hindu country. And there are almost 14 to 15% Muslims who live in the Terai belt, southern part of Nepal, and there has never been any communal violence in Nepal. And the Indians and the Hindus and Muslims of Nepal live peacefully with each other. Now, in the current context, and I'm glad that this was brought out about the United States, I would recommend very strongly that everyone here read an article in the New York Times last year by an Indian-British writer by the name of Pankaj Misra, who described the BJP in his article as an alt-right Hindu organization inspired by fascists and Nazis. We have just heard also that another scholarly person, Professor Banerjee from LSE, has said virtually the same thing. But what is interesting about Pankaj Misra's article is that he doesn't stop at India. In fact, he brings India into the broader spread of fascism in the world, in the United States, as we heard, under the Trump administration, but also increasingly in certain parts of Europe, such as Hungary, the Czech Republic, Austria, Italy, and other countries where there is a growing sense of Muslims, and especially looking at Muslims as terrorists or potential terrorists who should be kept out of these countries. And this approach is no less than what we have known as fascism in the past. And this kind of fascist approach feeds into each other, particularly when we see the current situation between India and the United States, where the two leaders, Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi, are fellow travelers in their hatred towards Muslims, in their view towards Muslims as being terrorists, and in their attitude in dealing with Muslims. Fortunately, the United States Constitution and its limitations do not allow Mr. Trump to do a lot of the things that he would like to do. But he has succeeded in putting certain Muslim countries on a visa control list. There are other things that he could not do that he would like to, but the point is that there is a commonality in approach that we see, and this hinges on, and this is my last point, this hinges on what we are facing today in terms of our confrontation with India arising from the Pulwama incident a few days ago. Because you have a frenzied crowd of Muslim haters and baiters, the Hindu mobs that are attacking not just Kashmiris in Jammu, but also Muslims and Kashmiris elsewhere. And this is a trend that has already existed and has already been underway. The lynching of Muslims for allegedly slaughtering cows, or for marrying Hindu women, or for so many other excuses that are found to target and victimize Indian Muslims. So this is an extremely dangerous environment that we are living in today. Not just the incident in Pulwama, but the incident taking place in the backdrop of this kind of frenzied Hindu nationalist, chauvinist approach towards the problem. So with these words, I thank you again for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Very much. I would like to send warmest gratitude to the panel for a very informative discussion. Hindutva is a reality, it's a serious concern, and it's a security threat, not only for the minorities in India, but also for Pakistan and the region for many centuries to come. And I would quote, the only way forward is to talk to people. Love people more, love territories less. This brings us to the end of our second session. Can I request Mr. Saeed Ahmed Qureshi, who is former Federal Secretary and member of IPS National Academic Council, to present a memento to the chair. Thank you very much.
Pleasure meeting again. MashaAllah, you were very active intellectually. कार्ड है आपका? आपसे मैं yes, पहले like to keep in touch, invite you sometime. और पेन है मेरे पास, और तो कुछ नहीं.
I would now invite you for lunch and prayer break. Lunch is on your left, my right, and prayer is on your right. And I would see you after 1 hour. Let me remind the students that there are certificates at the end of the seminar for them, which would add to their portfolio. 2:15. We'll get back together at 2:15 for a full interactive panel, which would be interactive and very interesting. So hope to see you soon after your lunch and prayer break. Thank you.